The text of today from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, verses 27 to 33, follows immediately after the healing of the blind man in 2 stages. In that miracle, which is only one of the 2 miracles in which Jesus uses external methods, we were told that the man is healed in 2 stages. He sees people like trees in the first stage, which is unclear sight, and he sees people clearly in the second stage, which is clear sight. This links up with the questions which Jesus asks his disciples. And the questions are also 2, and the first is, who do people say that I am? And the disciples respond with the people's answer. The people think Jesus is John the Baptist. Jesus is Elijah. Jesus is one of the prophets. John the Baptist is the forerunner. Elijah was the prophet according to Malachi, who was being sent by God to prepare the way. And one of the prophets is the understanding of the people at that time that they would arise a prophet very much like Moses, who would save his people from sin and take them to the promised land. However, that refers to the unclear sight of the man where he sees people like trees walking, because Jesus is not John. John is only a messenger. Jesus is not Elijah. Elijah is only a prophet. Jesus is not one of the prophets because he is infinitely greater than Moses. In the second question, Jesus asked the disciples as a group, not as individuals, but you, he said to them, who do you say that I am? In the question, the you is emphatic and the you is plural, which means it is a question posed to this inner group of people whom Jesus asks. They have been with him. They have encountered him at close quarters. They have seen his miracles. They have heard his teaching. They have lived and eaten and drank with him. And now, he wants to know whom they recognize he is. And so the question is, but you, he said to them, who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter becomes the spokesperson of the group when he responds to Jesus in Mark by saying, you are the Christ. The word Christ in English comes from the Greek Christos, which in turn comes from the Hebrew Messiah. All of them mean anointed one. So when we call Jesus Christ or Christos or Messiah, we are saying the same thing, that Jesus is the anointed one of God. And the Gospel of Mark is really a mystery gospel, and the mystery is revealed here in other places also, but here very beautifully when we imagine that like the man saw clearly, Peter on behalf of the disciples, and so the disciples also see clearly and recognize that Jesus is the Christ. However, a few verses later, we realize that that is not the case, because Peter's answer is merely a verbal answer. Peter's answer does not seem to stem from the heart. As soon as Jesus hears Peter's response, he commands his disciples not to tell anyone about it. And why does Jesus issue this command to silence? Because he realized that Peter's answer came from the head. Peter's answer came from the lips, and Peter's answer had to come from the heart. When it came from the heart, it would be the correct answer. At the moment, it was only from the head and from the lips, and so it needed to be transformed. And Jesus does it after commanding his disciples to silence. He tells them the kind of Christ that he has come to be when he speaks the first passion and resurrection prediction in the Gospel of Mark. And in it, he speaks about how, as the Christ, he will be put down. How, as the Christ, he will be judged. How, as the Christ, he will be condemned. How, as the Christ, he will be scourged. How, as the Christ, he will be nailed. But how also, as the Christ of God, he will rise from the dead. And so the first passion and resurrection prediction in the Gospel of Mark is in chapter 8, verse 31. So Jesus hears Peter's answer and explains the kind of Christ that he will be. We know that Peter's answer is merely an intellectual and a verbal answer. When Peter hears what the Lord says, he responds angrily and says, that should never happen to the Lord. The Lord cannot suffer. The Lord cannot die. The Lord cannot be crucified. The Lord cannot be that kind of Christ. And Peter rebukes the Lord. The word which Mark uses for rebuking is the same verb which Mark uses when Jesus exorcises demons. So Mark is telling us that Peter was telling Jesus that Jesus is possessed when he talks like this. That Peter cannot accept a suffering Messiah. He cannot accept a crucified Messiah. He cannot accept a Messiah who goes to the cross. And Jesus has to correct Peter's misunderstanding. Jesus has to rectify Peter's answer when he tells Peter to get behind him. Because Peter is not on God's side, but on human side. The humans would want Christ to be a conquering hero. The humans would want Christ to come galloping on a horse. The humans would want Christ to overthrow the enemies. But the Christ whom God has sent is a Christ who will win through love. A Christ who will win when his arms are spread out in total surrender. A Christ who will not impose his view on another. The Christ who will not impose his teaching on another, but a Christ who will constantly invite and beckon and call people to the fullness of life. This Peter cannot understand. And so Peter's answer remains at the intellectual and verbal level and has to go after the explanation of Jesus to the deeper level, to the level of the heart. It is only then will the command to silence stop. It is only then when Jesus will tell people that they can proclaim him, because immediately after talking about his passion, death and resurrection, Mark adds a phrase, and he said this plainly. In other words, he said it openly. He said it without mincing words. He said it not in parables, but in simple words which people could understand. Today, the Lord is asking me, who do you say that I am? What kind of a Messiah? What kind of a Christos? What kind of a Christ is the Lord for me? When I respond to the Lord and say, you are the Christ, what do I mean?